Hello, sisters. It's a pleasure for me to be able to talk to you today at a time when the feminist struggle against the ideology and practice of what is now called gender identity is being taken up all over the world. It is good to talk to the brave feminists who are involved in this struggle in Mexico. In the politics of gender identity, men are supposed to be able to transform by some mysterious process into women and vice versa. In fact, gender is a hierarchy. It comprises the sex stereotypes associated with power and powerlessness under male domination. So femininity requires that women and girls must take up little space, show much of their bodies, dress in crippling shoes, service men, do housework without complaint, and so on. In conformity to masculinity, on the other hand, men wear comfortable clothes that signify their position of power. Flat, comfortable shoes they can run in, can cover their bodies, and they get serviced by women. There is nothing natural about these forms of behavior. They signify status. They have nothing innately to do with sex, except that the power they represent is distributed according to sex, adult human females being the underclass and adult human males the ruling class. The great majority of men who claim to have female gender identities are heterosexual men who are masochists. The subordination of women is exciting to these men. There is a large section of the industry of pornography devoted to them, in which men are forced into women's clothes and into women's subordinate status. This is called sissification. These men have developed a wide range of activities which enable them to get sexual satisfaction from pretending to be women. There are huge numbers of websites and social media pages devoted to their excitements, on which they post photographs of themselves masturbating in the women's toilets, for instance. They can get deliciously excited by collecting used tampons in the women's toilets and stuffing them up their bottoms. And they document these practices for other hobbyists, as the practitioners of various of men's perversions are called. These men were traditionally called transvestites and are now called transgender. I'm going to talk today about how the sexual paraphilia or perversion of transvestism was transformed into a political movement which has intruded the sexual interests of these masochists into law and policy internationally. The word perversion was changed in the sexological literature to deviation and then paraphilia because the practitioners wanted a term that helped to normalize their perversions and was less stigmatizing. The progress of the sexual behavior of transvestism to a human right is a truly remarkable trajectory, and the effect has been very significant harm to the lives, opportunities, and rights of children, wives and partners, lesbians, and women in general. The gender identity movement has set back the progress of women's liberation by decades. Today, we're not supposed to talk about the sexual foundation of this male behavior, but I always do, and it does not make me popular. Up till the 1990s, the term used to refer to men with a sexual interest in pretending to be women was transvestites. This was the technical term used by medical doctors, the sexologists or scientists of sex, for these men. There's a very long history of men practicing transvestism. It was not until the second half of the 20th century, though, that the doctors developed the medical means to drug and cut up one group among the transvestites, those who wanted to permanently imitate women. This latter group was called transsexuals. The first men to be subjected to the brutal surgeries and treatments designed to make them into women in the 1950s, however, were homosexual men who were persuaded that it was better to suffer physical mutilation than to suffer the penalties and social stigma of loving their own sex. It should be understood that the practice of transgenderism is based to a subordinate extent upon gay hatred. All over the world, this is the case. Boys in India, Thailand, Brazil are transformed into hijras, ladyboys, travesties, in order to be prostituted by adult men who like to think of themselves as straight. This is also true in the West. Boys and young men are still being castrated in order to obscure their homosexuality and make them socially respectable, in the UK, for instance. But in the West, the overwhelming majority of men who pretend to be women are not gay, but heterosexual male masochists who are excited by women's subordinate status. They are transvestites. It is these heterosexual male transvestites who created the political movement to gain so-called gender identity rights. In the 1960s and 70s, a so-called sexual revolution took place in the West. The theorists of this sexual revolution all promoted the liberation of what they called the sexual minorities, which included transvestites, alongside paedophiles and sadomasochists. They included both male revolutionaries like Lars Ullerstam, whose book The Erotic Minorities was published in 1966, and the theorist of lesbian sadomasochism, Gail Rubin, whose piece called Thinking Sex was published in 1984. The transvestites now had manifestos of sexual freedom. They could promote themselves as a group of revolutionaries, demanding their slice of the pie. They modeled themselves on gay men and considered their liberation should follow on from that of their gay brothers. In practice, however, transvestites were still likely to be meeting up in secret clubs or going for weekends away, to some of which they took their wives, and being excited by carrying handbags and wearing bad wigs. They were not saying they were women, and indeed the transvestite clubs in London, for instance, determinedly kept out the transsexuals who they saw as going too far. Their hobby, though, was clearly a sexual pursuit. By the 1990s, this had changed. A transvestite activist movement was formed. They chose a new name, calling themselves transgender, to separate themselves from the sexual perversion of transvestism, and began a very determined campaign to desexualize their hobby and gain the right to practice it in public and to pretend to be women in women's spaces. They sought to persuade the medical profession, the psychiatrists, that their interest was nothing to do with sex. Instead, they said, they had an innate and perfectly natural condition of containing within themselves an essence of womanhood, which had been in them all along. This was called a female gender identity. The term transgender was new, but widely promoted, and by the late 1990s, many groups of people who would once not have found anything in common were caught up under this umbrella term. Prostituted gay men who wore drag, those once called transsexuals, ordinary heterosexual male transvestites, self-hating lesbians who sought the status of men, and a whole new group, unhappy children, or ones who played with the wrong toys, who were labeled transgender children. An empire was being born. The creation of this empire was backed by a body of academic theory, which argued that it was revolutionary to transgress boundaries and swap what it called genders. Many of the theorists argued that there were many genders to be played with. This was queer theory, and it came to dominate the academy in the 1990s. It pretended to be feminist, though it was the opposite. Feminist theorists had long understood gender to mean the sex stereotypes, which formed the foundation of women's oppression. We understood that gender needed to be abolished if women were to be free, not played with, imitated, or enshrined in the law. The medical profession was conquered by the early 1990s. They were subjected to fierce campaigns of abuse by the fetishists, which included destruction of the reputation of any scientists of sex who continued to say that transvestism was sexual. The activists protested at their meetings and they applied ceaseless pressure. They demanded that the wording of the diagnosis for those who experienced confusion about their gender or sex be changed because it was seen as stigmatizing. They succeeded in getting the diagnosis of gender identity disorder, which suggested a mental health condition, changed to gender dysphoria, which was seen as more neutral. On the secure basis of achieving the desexualization and destigmatization of their cross-dressing, the activists were able to advance a set of demands that they called rights, with no danger that they might be accused of just being sex fetishists. Now they were a special kind of person, innately possessed of opposite sex characteristics. Their problem was not one of mental health, but of social justice. The new political movement had removed any embarrassing sexual associations with their practice. It had a body of theory. It had the support of most progressive disciplines within the university and of the medical profession. Now, the transvestites had a shiny new carapace. They were the new group demanding rights in the same way that lesbians and gay men did. Importantly, the new movement gained the support of gay men and their organizations. In the early 2000s, many gay men's organizations were still rejecting the overtures of the transvestite movement. They thought that an association with transvestism would damage them, and now it has. The major lesbian and gay organizations in the West adopted transgender rights as their new main cause, because to continue to get money, they had to invent a new campaign after the success of gay marriage. In the 1990s, the transvestites started to create wish lists of their supposed gender rights. And in 2007, with the support of their gay brothers, they incorporated them into the Yogyakarta Principles. The principles were originally to be about lesbian and gay rights, but what were called gender rights were tagged on in a way which sanitized transvestism and fundamentally undermined gay rights. No one saw the transvestites as heterosexual men in bad wigs anymore. They were a new rights-bearing category, and their interests were apparently seamlessly entwined with gay rights and the cause of progress. It became impolite to mention or discuss the sexual interests of these men. Men with sexual paraphilias, after all, generally have more than one. So transvestites are quite likely to have a sexual interest in what is called age regression, or pretending to be little girls, or female babies, or in nappy fetishism. But by the 2000s, it had become socially and politically unacceptable to draw attention to the origin of the excitement that heterosexual men achieved from imitating the subordination of women and female children. The massaging of the practice of transvestism to become a social justice cause has made a great deal of progress. The rainbow flag has been transformed to incorporate the colours pink and blue, which represent sex stereotypes. It now has a profoundly reactionary, misogynist, and anti-lesbian and gay message. the transgendering of children in particular, which is carried out under the aegis of this ideology, is destroying the healthy bodies of young lesbians and gay boys and creating a mutilated generation of young people who dared to love the same sex. The main political aim of the transvestite activists was to change the law so that they could be recognized as having changed sex. They began to achieve success in the 2000s. In 2004, for instance, the Gender Recognition Act was introduced in the UK. It enabled applicants to get a certificate recognizing their change of gender, which was interpreted as sex, in the law. There was no critical response from feminists or anyone in civil society to enshrining in the law the sex stereotypes that the women's liberation movement had sought to abolish. The gender recognition certificate might more usefully have been called a sex stereotype recognition certificate, because no meaning other than the adoption of sex stereotypes was advanced for the word gender, and these people certainly did not change biological sex. Unfortunately, in the early 2000s, the feminist movement was in abeyance. There was no one protesting in the UK. The transvestite political movement pushed for legal recognition of change of sex internationally. Very quickly, any form of recognition which required evidence that a man had a new female gender identity came to be seen as inadequate. There was continual escalation of demands, and the object of the campaigners became self-identification, i.e., men and young people should be able to just sign a piece of paper to get their sex changed in law. Previous requirements that they should live as women, whatever that means, for a couple of years, and provide medical evidence, which had formed part of the UK Gender Recognition Act in 2004, were said to be tiresome, stigmatizing, and unnecessary. Many countries have now passed self-identification legislation, which creates the nonsense situation in law that men and women, and even children over 16, can just change their gender, understood as sex, at will, and even perhaps change about whenever they want. One sex 1 year, and the other sex the next, ad infinitum. Whether the law is changed or not, in the last decade, in countries all over the world, policy is being changed. The very influential and successful propaganda of the gender identity movement has led to huge changes in the way women and girls are treated. Men who claim to have female gender identities are not just like other groups of people who based on sex, race, class, or disability. Because they are pretending to be an actual oppressed minority of persons, women, their ambitions are profoundly harmful and they constitute a war on women. The harms to women have become very clear, and a new wave of feminist anger and organization has arisen. Women's rights have come under serious threat from this transubstantiation, i.e., the replacement of the category of sex by the notion of gender. The term sex has been increasingly supplanted by the term gender in policy as well as law, and women, persons of the female sex, are in the process of being disappeared. There has been a serious escalation in the severity and extent of the harms that women and girls face. To show the impact of this war against women, I wrote my book, Gender Hurts, which was published in 2014. In that book, I described the harms to the healthy bodies of the women and men who were mutilated with drugs and surgery to transgender them. I wrote about the way in which the transgendering of children should be seen as a new form of eugenics, which mutilated children who did not fit into sex stereotypes or would become lesbian or gay. I wrote about the harm that female partners of these men suffered and said it should be seen as psychological violence. I wrote about the way that men's demands were leading to threats to the safety and dignity of women as men intruded into women's bathrooms and prisons. But since the book came out, the landscape has been transformed. Whereas back in 2014, the vast majority even of feminists had no idea that there was a problem, it is now clear that transgender activists were working away behind the scenes to inveigle their ideas and their demands into state institutions, into non-government organizations, into universities, into health services. The lesbian and gay organizations, which had built respected reputations as vehicles for gay rights, moved seamlessly into campaigning for transvestites. They already had networks of influence set up with governments and international lawyers. They were already entwined into organizations and institutions to promote gay rights. Now they added gender. In the UK, for instance, the organization Stonewall had already been promoting gay rights in organizations and government for more than 2 decades before they took up the transgender rights in 2014. They had a scheme in place by which institutions, such as the National Health Service, could gain points and social approval by becoming Stonewall champions. The champions had the privilege of paying Stonewall a great deal of money yearly to gain this approval. They had to implement policies, change their language, submit themselves to monitoring by Stonewall. The Stonewall champions numbered nearly 1,000 and included government departments, such as the health service and the police, universities, charities that were supposed to serve children. All of these had to precisely align themselves with Stonewall ideas and policies. They had to ensure that no one could say that men could not become women. The effects are still unfolding. The work of Stonewall and equivalent groups to create obedience in the public world are replicated in other countries. Australia, for instance, has ACON. I don't know if there's such an organization in Mexico, but I expect there will be. But a crucial part of the creation of this empire has been to proceed by stealth. Indeed, documents have been found in which the necessity for stealth is laid out. The activists are well aware that if the public, the citizenry, the voters, got to know about what they were trying to do, then they would be defeated. The main aim of this stealth campaigning was to gain self-identification legislation. Many countries already have their legislation, and the citizenry is only now waking up to what it means. The stealth campaigners determinedly sought to influence policymakers behind the scenes. They were very secretive because they knew the majority of the public did not support them, as surveys have shown. In order for transvestite activists to roll out their agenda, they needed to silence feminists. For several years now, feminist critics have been subjected to arrest, to searches of their homes, which include removal of books from their bookshelves, to questioning and to being dragged into court because transgender activists have complained about hate speech. The hate speech consists of women saying that biological sex is real and that men cannot become women. At the same time, feminists have experienced campaigns of vicious abuse, including rape and death threats on social media. Women's right to freedom of assembly has come under serious threat. There have been protests designed to prevent feminist events, which have in recent weeks turned to violence, in Germany, for instance. The police do not protect the women's rights. The methods used to silence women who are critical of these men have included driving them out of their jobs, if not actually sacking them. The deprivation of livelihood from painters and embroiderers, novelists, and other cultural workers has been carried out through social media campaigns to destroy women's reputations. Another way in which gender identity activism is threatening women's rights is in the elimination of the category of women. In the absence of women as a category, the notion of women's rights becomes irrelevant. The campaigners have achieved a very alarming erasure of women. In healthcare, for instance, the term woman is being expunged in favor of people who chest feed and people who menstruate. Men are not affected. The same health sources direct men to have checks for prostate cancer, even though the word woman has been disappeared. What is taking place is a very thorough elimination of the category of woman from all the areas in which it has been most important to recognize women's specific needs. This takes the situation of women back to well before the beginning of the women's liberation movement in the 1970s. It was still possible to speak about women even in the 1950s, but this is by no means straightforward today. But feminists have woken up and set up a huge opposition to the transgender empire, which has now had great success in the UK, at least, in halting its forward march. Many feminist organisations were set up in the UK, some generalist, aimed at fighting the attempts to infiltrate women's space, to transgender organisations against transgendering children. Some are specialist and aim to stop transgendering children or get men out of women's prisons or get gender identity ideology out of schools. It is clear that the issue of gender identity has galvanised women and caused the upsurge of a new feminist movement. In 2018, a group of feminists in the UK, of whom I was one, came together to create the Women's Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. We called ourselves the Women's Human Rights Campaign, which is now called Women's Declaration International. The declaration was launched in a side event in New York at the time of the 2019 meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women, the United Nations organization that promotes the equality of women. It argues for the protection of women's sex-based rights from the intrusion of men into the category women. WDI has developed greatly in just a few years. The declaration has been signed by 32,524 people from 159 countries and is in collaboration with 455 non-government organizations. In the years since we launched the declaration, a number of breakthroughs have taken place in the UK, which show that we are winning our fight against the demands of the transvestite activist movement. Much that they had achieved has been rolled back. The attempt in the UK to get self-identification legislation has been abandoned by the government, though the Scottish government still intends to introduce such legislation there. There have been a number of very important legal victories. Feminists who have lost their jobs or had their livelihoods threatened for saying that men cannot become women, such as Maya Forstater and Alison Bailey, have won their cases at employment tribunals. It has now been established that women are free to critique gender identity, ideology, and practice. As feminists, we have made it clear that the organisation Stonewall was delivering inaccurate advice about the law and creating problems in organisations. Women withdrawals began from the Stonewall Champion scheme. Many government departments have been ordered to withdraw. Some universities have worked out that they must do so. It is the beginning of the end for that organisation. This viciously cruel experiment by the medical profession and the drug companies of transgendering children is coming to be seen as one of the most serious medical scandals ever to take place. The Tavistock Clinic, which transgenders children in the UK, was investigated for malpractice and is due to be closed down. The suing has now begun. 10 days ago, the Times newspaper published an article about a law firm that was seeking clients to take part in a class action lawsuit against the Tavistock Clinic in London, which transgenders children. There are many signs that at the very moment when the triumph of the transgender empire seems to be most complete over women's lives, the strength of a new feminist movement has turned back the tide. I don't know enough about the state of the struggle here in Mexico, but I'm sure that the tide can be turned back here too. I wish you strength, sisters. Thank you.